You're standing on a sun-baked hillside outside Jerusalem in the year 1187. The air reeks of sweat, blood and decay. Around you, thousands of armoured knights are about to charge into what they believe will be a glorious battle for God. Most of them will be dead within the hour, and if you were there, you wouldn't last 5 minutes. Today we're diving into the brutal reality of what it actually took to survive on a Crusader battlefield. And trust me, everything you think you know about medieval combat is wrong. The archaeological evidence we've uncovered paints a picture so horrifying that it makes modern warfare look merciful by comparison. Let's start with the most shocking truth. In medieval Europe, when knights fought other knights, casualty rates were ridiculously low. We're talking about battles where 900 French and English knights clashed and only 3 died. 3 out of 900. Why? Because heavy armour was nearly impenetrable, and there was serious money to be made in capturing nobles for ransom rather than killing them. Knights routinely suffered what historians call stupidly low casualties when fighting their European counterparts. But the Crusades, that was a completely different nightmare. When European forces marched into the Holy Land, they entered a world where their opponents weren't bound by the same chivalric codes. Muslim armies had zero interest in taking expensive prisoners. They were fighting a holy war just like the Crusaders, but with one crucial difference. They were fighting for their homeland, and they knew exactly how to exploit every weakness in Crusader tactics and equipment. Recent archaeological discoveries have given us our first real glimpse into what happened on these battlefields, and the evidence is absolutely terrifying. At Sidon Castle in Lebanon, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 25 Crusader soldiers from the 13th century. Every single skeleton bears unhealed wounds from stabbing, slicing, and blunt force trauma. But here's what makes this discovery so chilling. Most of the injuries were to the fighters' backs. Think about what that means. These weren't warriors who died facing their enemies in glorious combat. These were men who were cut down while running for their lives, probably by cavalry pursuing them at full gallop. The wound patterns tell a story of absolute terror and desperate flight. Some have sword wounds across the back of the neck, indicating they were likely captives who were executed by decapitation after the battle was over. This wasn't unusual. This was standard operating procedure. The siege of Vadum Iacob Castle in 1179 gives us an even more detailed picture of what awaited Crusader defenders when their positions were overrun. Saladin's forces stormed this castle north of the Sea of Galilee, and the archaeological evidence from the site reads like a horror story written in bone and steel. 5 defenders from the garrison have been studied in detail, and their remains reveal the systematic brutality of medieval siege warfare. These weren't quick, clean deaths. One soldier had multiple arrow wounds, including shots that should have been fatal on their own. But the severity of his sword wounds suggests he kept fighting even with arrows lodged in his body. All of his sword wounds were on the left side, indicating he was facing a right-handed attacker in close-quarter combat before finally being overwhelmed. The defenders had been stripped of their armour after death and dumped together with the corpses of horses that died in the battle. This wasn't just military efficiency, it was a deliberate message about what happened to those who resisted. But even if you survived the actual fighting, your nightmare was just beginning. Disease killed more Crusader soldiers than all the battles combined, and the conditions in medieval army camps were a perfect breeding ground for every pathogen known to mankind. Picture this. Thousands of men crammed together with no understanding of hygiene whatsoever. Streets that were open sewers, no running water, dung, garbage and animal carcasses thrown into ditches and rivers, fleas, rats and mice flourishing in conditions so filthy that they created the perfect environment for infectious disease to spread like wildfire. Laboratory analysis of medieval latrines at Crusader sites has identified a horrifying catalogue of parasites and disease-causing organisms: roundworm, whipworm, fish tapeworm, beef and pork tapeworm, and multiple protozoa that cause dysentery and diarrhea. When you're already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, any one of these could kill you in days. Many Crusader armies were defeated not by Muslim forces, but by scurvy and starvation. They simply couldn't find adequate food and water in hostile territory, and men began dropping dead from malnutrition before they ever saw combat. The bacterial diseases that ran rampant through siege camps were especially deadly, turning what should have been temporary military positions into death traps that claimed thousands of lives. The weapons themselves were designed for maximum lethality in ways that would shock modern observers. Arrows fired from medieval longbows created entry and exit wounds in skulls that archaeologists compare to modern gunshot wounds. In one gruesome example from the Sidon excavation, researchers found evidence of an arrow that pierced the top of a warrior's right eye and exited through the back of his skull, leaving devastating wounds that would have caused instant death. But arrows were just the beginning. Medieval battlefields featured an arsenal of specialized killing tools, siege engines hurling massive stones that could crush a man instantly, spiked maces that could penetrate even the heaviest armor, war hammers designed to cave in helmets, and swords sharp enough to cleave through bone with a single blow. The archaeological record shows that medieval warriors didn't die from clean, quick attacks. They died from multiple traumatic injuries that led to agonizing deaths. One skeleton might show evidence of sword wounds, arrow impacts, and blunt force trauma, all on the same body. These men fought until they physically couldn't continue, and then they died in ways that would haunt anyone who witnessed them. And here's what makes this even more terrifying. Everything I've just described represents the lucky ones. These were the soldiers whose bodies were actually recovered and buried. For every skeleton archaeologists have found, there were dozens more whose remains were left to rot on the battlefield, picked clean by scavengers, or thrown into unmarked pits that we'll never discover. The brutal mathematics of Crusader battlefield survival weren't just about individual skill or bravery. They were about being in the right place at the right time, having the right equipment, fighting the right opponents, and getting incredibly lucky with disease, weather, supply lines, and 1,000 other factors completely beyond any individual soldier's control. So when we talk about lasting seconds on a Crusader battlefield, we're not being dramatic, we're being mathematically precise. The average medieval battle lasted somewhere between 30 minutes to 3 hours. But for individual combatants, the moment formations broke and chaos erupted, survival was measured in heartbeats, not minutes. Archaeological evidence shows that most fatal wounds occurred during the pursuit phase, when organized fighting devolved into a massacre of fleeing soldiers. Consider the psychological horror of it all. Logical. You're wearing 60 pounds of metal armor in desert heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The weight alone would exhaust a modern athlete within minutes. Medieval soldiers had to march for weeks in this equipment, fight in it, and somehow maintain enough strength to survive when everything went wrong. The noise would have been absolutely overwhelming. Thousands of men screaming battle cries, horses neighing in terror, metal clashing against metal, and underneath it all, the wet sounds of weapons finding their mark. Many soldiers probably went deaf from the sheer volume, losing one of their most critical senses right when they needed it most. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the complete unpredictability of medieval combat. Modern warfare has rules, protocols, and at least some attempts at minimizing civilian casualties. Medieval battlefields were free-for-all slaughterhouses where anything could happen to anyone at any moment. Take the crossbow bolts that archaeologists have found embedded in Crusader skeletons. These weren't precision weapons. They were area effect killers designed to punch through armor and keep going until they hit something vital. The bolt that killed you might have been aimed at someone else entirely, fired by a soldier you never even saw from a position you couldn't identify. The fighting was so chaotic that friendly fire casualties were common. In the heat of battle, covered in blood and dust, wearing similar armor, it became nearly impossible to distinguish friend from enemy. Crusader chronicles are full of accounts of knights accidentally killing their own comrades in the confusion. And if you somehow survived the initial combat, if you managed to avoid the diseases, if you weren't cut down during a retreat, you still faced the aftermath. Medieval battlefields were places where wounded men lay dying for days, calling out for water that never came. Scavengers, both human and animal, would strip the dead and leave the dying to face whatever horrors awaited them. The archaeological evidence from mass graves shows that many wounded soldiers were simply left where they fell. Some skeletons show evidence of healing from previous battles, proving that a few lucky individuals did survive multiple engagements. But for every healed wound archaeologists find, there are dozens of unhealed trauma marks that tell stories of final, fatal encounters. Here's what really drives home the impossibility of survival. Even the most elite warriors, the heavily armored knights who represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology, died in droves during the Crusades. If men who had trained their entire lives for warfare, who wore the best armor money could buy, who fought alongside equally skilled companions, couldn't reliably survive these encounters, what chance would anyone else have? The hard truth is that individual skill, courage, and preparation could only take you so far. Medieval warfare was ultimately a numbers game played with human lives, where survival often came down to pure chance. You might be the greatest swordsman who ever lived, but an arrow fired blindly into a crowd could still find the gap between your helmet and your mail coif. The Crusades lasted for nearly 200 years, and during that time, hundreds of thousands of men marched east believing they were embarking on a holy mission that would secure their place in paradise. The archaeological record tells us that most of them found only unmarked graves in foreign soil. When we look at the evidence, when we examine the bones and the wounds and the circumstances of their deaths, one thing becomes crystal clear. The medieval battlefield was humanity at its most brutal, and survival was never guaranteed, no matter who you were or how well prepared you thought you might be. So the next time someone romanticizes medieval warfare or talks about the glory of knightly combat, remember the 25 skeletons at Sidon Castle. Remember the arrow wounds that look like bullet holes. Remember the sword cuts across the backs of fleeing men. Remember that for all the pageantry and mythology we've built around the Crusades, the reality was far simpler and far more terrible. You wouldn't have lasted seconds. None of us would have, and that's exactly why these stories matter, because they remind us that the past wasn't a fairy tale. It was real people facing real horror, and somehow, against all odds, a few of them lived to tell the tale.